Welcome to In a Nutshell, the podcast dedicated to all things agricultural consulting. I'm Dylan Brush here with soil genius and ag consultant Bill Brush, and we're delighted to accompany you on this journey where we break down the different aspects of agricultural consulting. In each episode, we'll dive into the realm of agriculture through the eyes of Bill Brush, where consultants like Bill play a vital role in empowering farmers, agribusiness, and agricultural organizations. If you're passionate about agriculture, problem solving, and enjoy a little bit of detective work, this podcast is tailor-made for you.
Welcome back. This is Bill Brush with In a Nutshell. Today I'm going to talk about an article that I read the other day. It was put in a magazine. It was a commentary by a guy by the name of Jeffrey Mitchell. And what he talked a lot about, which I find very, very interesting, and he talked about heresy in farming, okay? You know, and an easy definition of heresy is a belief or opinion that strongly opposes established, official, or commonly accepted beliefs. So where is our heresy in farming, particularly in California, where I'm from and have my family's been here for over 165 years. So what he detailed, which is really interesting, was he talked about a book written by Edward Faulkner called Plowman's Folly. And it still is one of the highest rated in soil science literature. And the premise of it, and it actually went into why and how, that everybody, and that's a strong word, but almost everybody that I can think of at a certain time has plowed their field with what's called a moldboard plow. And that basically is one that goes down and turns over anywhere from 12 to, I've seen 16 and 18 inches, really deep plowing. Anyway, they turn that ground over, and there has never been scientific reason to do that, to actually plow fields like that. And yet, as I mentioned in the definition of heresy, it was an opinion that was strongly held and established over years. I have a pretty good idea of what and why it started, because years ago, when we started to develop across the United States, a lot of the Midwest, and probably even on the East Coast at some point, they started to open up this, and they planted into these fresh kind of fields that had never been touched. They had just been annual grasses that were native to that area that had grown, and they had just seeded themselves and reseeded themselves and just kind of regenerated themselves year after year after year. Well, when we came in and we planted, we had really pretty good luck. The thing that was different now was what we grew, we harvested. We took whatever that grain crop was, could be corn, could be wheat, and we used the grain crop. So we were actually removing part, and we didn't have this natural 100% recycling. We were just starting to remove things. If you were growing hay crops, then you were harvesting those hay crops and putting them up so you would have food for your livestock during the wintertime. And obviously wintertimes could last, so they put up a lot of hay in those days. And again, you're talking about a removal. Now, that removal could have been recycled back with some of the manure, but a lot of it was just piled up or was scattered back over certain areas and not necessarily evenly distributed. But the thing they started to do, and someone found that when they put a plow to it and then planted into that plowed ground, one, it got rid of a lot of the duff and heavy stuff on the top. But what it really did, it would release the nutrients from the soil. What it was the built up, stabilized soil humus that had been built up for thousands of years in these fields. And now we were taking that and we were releasing it. And you had tremendous growth and tremendous crops. So in farming, there's an old adage, if something works, what do? Well, you do it again. And you do it again, and you do it again, but you're not replacing any of that fertility. It's all removal. And as you remove more and more of it, it gets a little less fertile and a little less fertile. So pretty soon it's crop failure. And at that time, of course, there was plenty of land. Well, this doesn't work anymore, so we'll move over one block and start all over again, clear out trees if they were in the way, and make a whole new place to grow our grains and crops that we wanted to do for forage for our livestock. And it did just as well until it played out. And so we just kept moving along, taking these soils down to where their nutrient content was really, really bad. And it was really interesting to me as a soil scientist and someone that was into understanding what the value of soil humus was. I took a trip. I was lecturing a bunch of farm groups in Nebraska for a company, talking about soil fertility, etc. And they were bringing up soil samples at breaks and everything, and I'd look at them. And in those prairie soils of Nebraska, where you would think they would have a lot of soil humus built up over the years, they were next to nothing. And even after they had been farming all these years, they were still plowing. They were still, chiseling. They were doing a lot of these mechanical, I call it mechanical engineering, breaking up the soils before they planted their crop. And they still hadn't built up their soil fertility. And so that's what the premise of the Plowman's Folly was, is doing something that had been accepted and nobody really knew why, because at some point it had worked. And I believe that's why it had worked. And so now what we see is we get an interesting thing that we're doing back, if you go back to this plowing, but it gave rise, after people started looking, to what we call the no-tillage innovation, which we currently are doing lots and lots of back in the Midwest. It's becoming more and more the practice. And a lot of people want to put a name on it. And I know there's some people that will be in that regenerative bucket, and there'll be some people in the organic bucket, and there'll be some people in the sustainable bucket, and they'll all be doing all of these things. And even with all that, you'll still have people out there plowing, getting to be less and less, because what are we doing? We're changing that official or commonly accepted way of doing things is now becoming no-till. And so there's plenty of talk on how all of these new ways to produce the same crops have been grown for at least 150 years. And they're looking at it completely different. Even in California, where I've seen a lot of people still plowing fields. And one of the things that they do is they'll grow an alfalfa crop for 4 to 5 seasons here in the valley. And then after they take it out, their first crop they come back is usually going to be field corn for silage for dairies. And they'll have by far the best crop of corn that they'll have the entire time they're out until they go back into an alfalfa rotation. And that corn will be the best in that first year. A lot of people think it's just because of the stored nitrogen in the legumes that are there, and that is part of it, because it can tap in to that nitrogen that's stored in those nodules of that alfalfa legume, and then they will use it on demand when they need it, in addition to what else is applied. That fertilizer is something that is really I think you would call it a 20th century invention, and it's beginning to be more and more refined as we're getting into the 21st century. But it becomes not only just fertilizer, it becomes timing, it becomes volume, it becomes type. So there's all kinds of different ways that people are doing this, where when we started a lot of this moldboard plowing, they didn't have fertilizer as such. And so they just, some of them would work that manure back in, but for the most part, they still were degrading that soil, breaking down the soil humus for all those years. And it led to some very, very poor soils that some people still farm today. But some of them are beginning to get some of their fertility back by doing some things to build the carbon back in. And that carbon source then can become stabilized to hold more nutrients, which when it's stabilized becomes the really active part, which we call the soil humus. After I read this article, it occurred to me that we see the same thing in California in many different avenues. And I'm going to put one major example. When I first started in the consulting business, one of the things that I had done on my own farm for years was the commonly accepted practice of taking your potassium in a crop that uses a lot, which would be almonds, and put it in a band. And that band would be, a couple inches high and probably 4 inches across. And you put it just down each side of the tree. Okay. Straight line, looked like a big white chalk line all the way down. And that was just the accepted practice. And so what happened was I was introduced to Neil Kinsey, and he asked me why we did that. And I didn't really know, but I knew it was the accepted practice at that time because I had little knowledge of what he was going to be able to teach me. And Neil says, I don't understand. That really isn't going to be any better. In fact, it's probably worse. And I, at that point, started to think, well, why? And he explained to me that, he curious as to why they did it that way. And I hustled around and found the work that they did up in Northern California. And what they did was they did some banding studies because they were having a hard time getting enough potassium into the plant. And with that in mind, what they did was this banding technique. And their basically experiment was fairly simple, which is you took so many pounds per acre, they put 500 pounds per acre, and they put it in a band. They put 500 pounds per acre, and they broadcast it through the entire crop. Then they took 1,000 pounds and they banded it. And then they took 500 pounds and they broadcast. Then at the end of the year, they checked tissues, and the tissues in the banded fertilizer was higher than those in the broadcast. And so then they looked that there really wasn't a lot of difference between the 500 pounds and the 1,000 pounds. So they recommended that they would need somewhere around that 500 pounds per acre figure in a band, and you would increase your potassium uptake by your plants. One of the problems with that experiment, in my mind, once I started to look at it and understanding soils better, is they didn't take farming into consideration. It wasn't just a straight band, and that was the secret. What that band did was put 500 pounds or 1,000 pounds of potassium out. And then during the year, we would do things like mow the weeds, with a flail mower. And every time we did that, we would disturb that potassium. And you would hit that little white pile of potassium on each side of the tree, and you would break it up a little bit, and you would distribute potassium across the whole orchard floor underneath that. And then you might do that 3 or 4 times a year. In addition to that, when you harvested, you would do things like sweep it, and then take your harvester would then pick up that and then blow it out, and you got it distributed again. So really the secret to that was because if you just banded it to begin with, you put one application, and in the soil conditions that were there, which were heavier soils with high magnesium and very little calcium. So it tied up, you didn't really get the benefit of the potassium that way. But when you put on multiple applications, you allowed the plant, particularly in those top few inches, to be able to get into that potassium before it got tied up and get it into the plant. And results were better. But if you left that tied up and it just put it straight in a band, it would never be of any value to you because it's just sitting there in a band. And the talk was to overwhelm the exchange capacity. Well, when you have a real light sandy soil, how are you going to overwhelm it in a small area like that? And so it didn't make any sense to me. So I went about disproving this, and we did multiple applications of potassium, and we found we got better with less and more into the plant and better production. But it was amazing to me how many growers would say, I don't believe you because I saw them do this experiment up here and it works because we saw the results. And because of that, it got me thinking that, when I saw this article, that you have to understand how that experiment's put together. And then you have to see, what are you doing? It's not in a vacuum. You're not lab and test. It's not lab tested as such. What it is it's field tested. And you get the imperfections of farming that now can skew your results. It's one of the reasons that a lot of university professors have a hard time perfecting, field experiments, because there's so much variability in soil, so much variability in water, so much variability into the farming practices of one individual versus another. What if you were no-till and never put anything on there and you literally sterilize the ground? I always told people when they look at a band like that, what grows in the band? And you would look at this white chalk mark from beginning to end, and I said, weeds won't grow in the band. And when you look and dug down along the side of the band, you would see the hair roots come up to that band of fertilizer and then be burned because there is too much positive charge sitting there in that potash. There is just too much electrical charge, and that particular area becomes pretty much sterilized. And if you think that's sterilized, then what good is it to the tree? It was the farming practices that really ultimately made the difference here. And so what I did was, as I said, put on multiple applications, and then I have more control because I can work on timing. I can work on when I do it, how much I put on at any individual time. And we worked into some great yield advantages. So when you look at this, what we'll call heresy in farming, it's know that what your experiment is may show you something that's not true. And so it's always, the heresy is to challenge the norm, challenge what we currently do and find out why we do it. We used to do a lot of flood irrigation. Now, almost anybody, including me, will tell you you're going to be better off if you've got an irrigation system that you can control the volume everywhere across the field, and you can put exactly what you need, and then do it rapidly and quickly and efficiently, and then keep your soil and air, which is where plants need to survive, keep those in perfect balance all the time. And when you do, you'll get the best results. So all of a sudden now you're seeing almost any new planting going in, it's got an irrigation system. Sometimes drip, sometimes micro sprinklers, sometimes sprinklers, but there usually is some type of irrigation system on permanent crops. With that being the case, you find pretty much immediately that in this particular situation, know what you're doing. Because farming, I said sometimes, I tell a lot of growers, and I'll end with this. When I'm talking to farmers, I said, everything is drawn up on a chalkboard that's for perfection. Then we're immediately going to go out and mess it up because what are we going to do? We're going to farm, which is something that is imperfect. And so because it's imperfect, we need to take that in consideration when we're doing any kind of testing. So remember, see those tests, take and use it on a portion of your field, and then think scientifically why it would work or why it wouldn't work, or find a consultant that's got a good head on his shoulders and will tell you exactly why some things will work, and that may work on you, but it won't work on your neighbors because of different conditions. So I will leave it there for now. And so until next time, stay curious.
Thanks for another absolutely outstanding episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell, Bill. I'm sure that everyone listening surely enjoyed what you had to say about farming and all of its heresy. Make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and always stay curious.